They tell you it's just a job, a few days alone in a tower watching over the woods, but they don't tell you about the knocking, or the way the shadows move when they shouldn't. They don't warn you that the rules aren't just suggestions, they're your only chance of survival. I'm Kyle, and I'm starting to wish I'd listened. Welcome to Sunday Scares, where the shadows whisper and nightmares come to life. But did you know that 89% of you watching aren't subscribed? If you love chilling tales that keep you up at night, hit like to feed the darkness. And subscribe if you dare. Now turn off the lights, settle in, and let the horror begin. I've read all the books. I've listened to the stories, the warnings, the old-timers talking about the tower, but I never really believed them. Ghost stories, myths, and urban legends, the kind of things you hear around campfires. Nothing that should have made me feel nervous about starting my first solo shift as a fire lookout. It's just a job, a simple job. Or at least that's what I told myself when they dropped me off here, high on this mountain ridge, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the weight of my own thoughts. The fire tower is built to withstand everything: storms, the thickest of winds, wildfires. But standing there at the base, looking up at the tall, steel structure, I felt small, like I wasn't meant to be here. The air was thick, damp, and the forest below stretched out in all directions, its vastness both awe-inspiring and suffocating. The only way in or out of the tower is a long hike or a helicopter ride. No one's coming up here unless they need something, and that something doesn't include company. As I made my way up the narrow, creaking steps that led to the small cabin perched at the top of the tower, I couldn't help but glance back down at the forest. The trees were a dark, endless sea, their silhouettes swaying gently in the wind. I'd heard the stories, the ones about strange noises in the night, the unexplainable things people had seen, the whispers about this very tower. They told me to take the rules seriously, but I thought they were just people who got lonely in the wilderness and let their minds wander too far. I didn't think much of it then. The cabin is small, just enough room for a cot, a table with a few maps scattered across it, and a radio that crackled to life when I flicked the switch. The walls are lined with faded yellowed papers listing rules and safety procedures. I glanced over them for the 100th time. 5 simple guidelines that were supposed to keep me safe. Rule number 1, never leave the cabin after dark. Rule number 2, do not make any sound when you hear knocking on the tower. Rule number 3, never look out over the ridge at midnight. Rule number 4, do not engage with any voice you hear calling your name. Rule number 5, never trust your own shadow. At first glance, they seemed like simple things, precautions for the usual hazards of the wilderness. But something about the way they were written, it wasn't just a cautionary tale. There was something underlying them, something urgent. I settled into the cabin, unpacking my gear, trying to keep my mind busy. The first day had been calm. The view from the top of the tower was breathtaking. Endless green, the occasional flash of a bird or a deer darting through the trees, the sun sinking slowly behind the horizon. But as the light began to fade, so did the warmth of the day, leaving only the chill of the mountain air. The wind picked up, a constant rustling through the trees below, and that's when the first thing happened, the knocking. I remember sitting in the chair by the window, my feet up on the small table, thumbing through the logbook left by the previous lookouts. Most entries were routine: weather reports, notes on animal sightings, the occasional mention of strange noises. There was nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary except one entry from a week ago. It was short, a simple sentence that made my stomach churn. Heard knocking again. Didn't open the door. Stay safe. I didn't think much of it at first. It had to be some animal, right? Something small and nocturnal, maybe a raccoon or a bear tapping against the walls. Maybe the wind. I told myself that. I told myself everything but the truth. The first knock came just after dusk, too soft to be heard over the wind at first, but then louder, sharper. A rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the tower. I froze, listening. The knocking came again, louder now, unmistakable. I glanced nervously at the door. It was so quiet otherwise, the kind of silence you don't realize you're in until it's broken. My heart rate sped up, but I kept my gaze fixed on the door, my hands sweating in my lap. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind. Do not make any sound when you hear knocking on the tower. I bit my lip and slowly leaned forward, trying to peer through the small window. But all I could see was the thick darkness of the forest below, shadows of the trees that stretched high into the night. I heard the knocking again, the rhythm growing louder, more urgent. My breath caught in my throat. I stood, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. Just the wind. I hadn't seen anything unusual. But I was wrong. The knocking didn't stop. I remembered the rules. Rule number 2. Rule number 2. Do not make any sound when you hear knocking. I took a step away from the window, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but I couldn't tear myself away from the door. I wanted to open it, to look outside, to see if something was really out there. But the rules, I couldn't. I wouldn't. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started. Silence. Deep, suffocating silence. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I looked around the cabin, feeling suddenly aware of the weight of the solitude. The darkness outside was thick now, and the only sound was the wind howling through the trees. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Minutes passed. An hour. 2. The radio crackled, breaking the silence. It was the park manager. His voice came through, warm but distant. Hey, Kyle. How's everything up there? Just wanted to check in. You're good to go, right? I glanced at the radio, then back at the door. The knocking had stopped, but the unease hadn't. I'm good, I replied, trying to sound normal, to hide the unease creeping into my voice. Good, good. Just remember the rules, Kyle. They're there for your safety. Don't take them lightly. See you tomorrow. The transmission ended, leaving me alone in the silence once more. The night felt heavier now, suffocating. The wind had died down, but the silence was worse than any storm. I sat back in the chair, staring at the window, trying to force my mind to relax. I told myself the knocking was nothing. It was just an animal. Maybe a branch brushing the tower. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something wasn't right. And I hadn't even been here a full day. I glanced at the clock. Midnight was approaching. Rule number 3 came back to me. Never look out over the ridge at midnight. I didn't understand why at first, but now, with the knocking still fresh in my mind, the dread began to settle in. Midnight. The ridge. I wasn't sure what it meant, but I wasn't about to find out. I thought I could handle this. I thought I could do the job. But the longer I sat in that cabin, the more the weight of the rules pressed down on me. I wasn't sure what was out there, or what the knocking meant, but I wasn't about to test it. I wasn't alone here, not anymore, and I wasn't sure I was ever going to be. The night felt endless. I couldn't stop looking at the clock, each minute dragging by slower than the last. The knocking had stopped, but the unease remained, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The silence had returned, deep and suffocating. The wind outside had died, leaving the world outside to feel like a dead holding breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the rules. The 5 rules, burned into my mind. They told me they were for my safety, for my survival. But I didn't know if I believed that anymore. The first rule seemed simple enough at least. Never leave the cabin after dark. Okay, fine. That one was easy to follow. Who would want to leave a safe, warm cabin and head out into the cold, dark woods at night? But the other rules, they didn't make sense to me. They felt strange, unnatural, like the kind of thing someone says to keep you paranoid. But that knocking, it was real. I heard it, and it wasn't an animal. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. The clock ticked away the hours. Midnight came and went without any sign of the ridge, but I stayed glued to the window, watching the dark expanse of the forest below. I wasn't sure why I was so drawn to it, why I kept staring at the thick trees and the blackness between them. I told myself I was just making sure nothing was moving, making sure there were no surprises waiting in the shadows. But that's not what it felt like. It felt like something was pulling me, calling me to the window. A soft whisper broke the silence. I jerked my head toward the door, straining my ears. It wasn't loud enough to be heard over the wind, but there it was. A voice. A whisper. Not the wind, not the trees. This voice came from the direction of the forest. My heart hammered in my chest. Don't engage with any voice you hear calling your name. I had to fight the instinct to open the door, to run outside and see who was there. But I knew the rules. I had no idea what was out there, or who. And whatever it wasn't worth finding out. The whispering stopped, but I could still feel the tension in the air, thick as smoke. I stood up slowly, trying to shake the feeling that the forest was somehow alive, that it was watching me, judging me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the clock, the radio, anything else. But as the minutes passed, the shadows began to shift. At first I thought it was just my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in a place this isolated for too long. But then, it happened again. I looked at the far corner of the room, where the shadows from the small table stretched across the floor. There was something wrong about them. They weren't moving with the same rhythm as the light. It wasn't the usual play of shadows created by the weak lamp on the table. They seemed off. They shifted unnaturally, twisting, contorting in ways they shouldn't have. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and then looked again. There it was. A faint, almost imperceptible movement. The shadows seemed to stretch and shrink as though they were being pulled by some invisible force. But there was no breeze. There was nothing in the room that could explain it. Rule number 5 echoed in my mind. Never trust your own shadow. I turned away from the corner, my pulse quickening. I knew what it meant, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't possible, right? The shadows couldn't be alive. They couldn't move on their own. Still, I couldn't stop looking at them, watching as they stretched across the floor, reaching toward me. It felt like they were pulling me in, like I was supposed to follow them, to let them lead me. But I fought the urge. I had to focus, to stay calm. I took a few deep breaths, forcing myself to move away from the window, away from the corner where the shadows had been moving. But the unease never left. It clung to me, thick and suffocating, like the darkness itself had come alive in the cabin. The radio crackled to life again, breaking the silence. "Kyle? You there?" It was the park manager's voice again, distant and almost distant. "Just checking in. You holding up okay?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. My mind was still buzzing with the strange feeling of the shadows, and I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know if I could. How could I tell someone that the shadows were moving, or that I'd heard something whispering outside? They'd think I was losing it. "I'm fine," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to me. "Everything's good." "All right. Keep your head up, rookie. Stay safe." The transmission ended, and the silence crept back into the room. The shadows had stopped moving, but the tension remained, thick and heavy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on anything else. I could hear the wind starting to pick up outside again, the low whistle of it echoing through the trees. But it wasn't just the wind. I could hear something else now, something faint but unmistakable. A tapping, a slow, rhythmic tapping coming from the floor above me. My heart stopped. The sound wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from above, from the very top of the tower. I froze. The knocking had started again, but this time it was louder, closer. And this time, it wasn't just on the walls. It was as if something, or someone, was walking above me, tapping on the metal floors as it made its way down. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know who it was, but I wasn't going up there. The clock ticked away the minutes. I stared at it, counting down the time. It felt like hours passed. The knocking stopped. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was quiet again. The kind of silence that feels louder than any noise. But just as I thought it was over, I heard something else. A voice. A deep, guttural sound. It was muffled, distant, but unmistakable. Kyle? My blood ran cold. The voice came from above, the same direction the knocking had come from. The wind howled again, louder than before. But it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that made my stomach churn. Kyle. The voice was closer now. It was speaking my name. My heart raced. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stay here. But I remembered the rules. Do not engage with any voice you hear calling your name. But it was too late. I had already heard it. The darkness outside felt heavier now, as if the very air was thickening with something I couldn't name. I hadn't slept in hours, my mind buzzing with every creak of the cabin and every whisper of the wind. The knocking had stopped, but the presence I felt outside, on the ridge, lingered. The voice from above still echoed in my mind, taunting me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me to break, to give in. I kept thinking about rule number 3. Never look out over the ridge at midnight. It was just a rule, right? A silly, superstitious warning meant to keep us safe. At least that's what I'd told myself when they handed me the guidebook. But now it felt like something more. It felt like a warning, not just from the park, but from something older, something more dangerous. My eyes kept drifting toward the window, where the ridge sat just beyond the cabin, cloaked in shadow. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to give in to that overwhelming pull, the sense that if I just looked for 1 second, I would see something that would haunt me forever. I had no reason to believe anything was out there. Nothing was ever really out there, right? It was just the woods, just the wind, the trees, the way the darkness could play tricks on you. But there it was again, the pull. I couldn't stop staring. The clock ticked on, and the minute hand slowly crawled toward midnight. My breath caught in my throat as the second hand ticked past the final mark, signaling the witching hour. Midnight. I fought the urge to stand up, to make my way to the window. I tried to distract myself. I focused on the dull hum of the radio, the low static that was becoming more of a constant companion than the park manager's voice. But then a flash of light. I froze. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some distant reflection of the moon or a beam from a passing plane. But no, there was something out there. It wasn't the moon. It was a pale glow, like a lantern. I could see it clearly through the glass. A soft, unearthly light hovering just above the trees. And it wasn't moving like a normal light should. It stayed there, stationary, hanging above the ridge, casting an unnatural glow across the treetops. I stared at it, mesmerized by the strange luminescence. It felt like I was being drawn into its light, pulled toward it as though it were calling me. Rule number 3, never look out over the ridge at midnight. I had no choice. My hand was already on the window, the glass cold against my skin. I didn't think. I didn't reason. I just pressed my palm against the window and leaned closer, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to see more clearly. The light was too bright, too powerful. It cast long shadows across the forest floor, making everything below it appear distorted, stretched. And that's when I saw it. A figure. It was standing just outside the glow, a silhouette of something. Not human. Tall, too tall, with arms that stretched far beyond what was natural. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. Or at least I thought it was watching me. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew I shouldn't be looking. I knew I had broken the rule. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure seemed to sway, but it didn't move closer. It was as though it was waiting for something. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't the figure that was watching me. It was the ridge. The land itself, as if the ground beneath my feet were alive, observing every movement, every breath. A soft, mocking laugh echoed through my head, the same voice that had called my name earlier. It wasn't outside, it wasn't in the room with me. It was in my mind. "Come closer," the voice whispered. I staggered back, shaking my head violently. No, I couldn't. I had to stay inside. I had to follow the rules. Never leave the cabin after dark. I spun around, my pulse racing, my thoughts in a frenzy. The rules had kept me alive so far. They had to be true, right? This thing, whatever it was, it didn't follow rules. It wanted me to break them. It was trying to make me go outside, to leave the safety of the cabin. I ran to the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. The radio crackled to life again, and for a moment, I thought it was the manager. But this wasn't his voice. This wasn't any human voice. It was the same voice that had called my name earlier, this time with a sense of urgency and hunger. "Kyle." The whisper was softer, almost a purr. It slid through the cracks in the cabin, as though it could slip past the walls and enter my mind. "You have to come. It's almost too late. You won't survive if you stay inside." I staggered back from the door. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Every part of me screamed to open the door, to run. But then I remembered the 5th rule: never trust your own shadow. I turned around quickly, my eyes darting to the floor. There, in the dim light of the cabin, I could see my shadow stretched out across the wooden floor. But it wasn't just my shadow. It was distorted, twisted. The arms were longer, the figure contorted. The outline of my body was off too. It looked like something was standing behind me, mirroring every movement I made. It was impossible. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My shadow didn't move with me. It stayed behind, unmoving, like it was frozen in place. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on my shadow. But the moment it touched it, the shadow seemed to ripple, like ink in water. It writhed and stretched, then snapped back into its original position, like a rubber band being pulled and released. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just being watched from outside. The entity, the force, it was here with me, inside. I turned back toward the window, but the light from the ridge had disappeared. The forest was black again, swallowed up by the night. It was over. Or was it? The fear gnawed at me, the uncertainty. Something was coming. I needed to follow the rules. But would it be enough to survive the night? The night felt impossibly still. My heartbeat, which had once raced in terror, now pounded with a hollow rhythm in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, something ancient and unfathomable that was just beyond my reach. I couldn't tell if it was outside the cabin or if it had already crept in, surrounding me like an invisible fog. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my fingers white-knuckling the cold metal, the beam flickering every now and then, as though even the light itself was scared. My shadow still stretched unnaturally across the floor, and every time I moved, it followed, twisting with a life of its own. I could feel the weight of it, like it was pressing against me, as though something was tethered to me, something that wasn't quite me. I couldn't look at it any longer. I forced my gaze back to the walls, the radio still crackling faintly in the background, the unsettling static almost mocking me. I was trapped. I had to follow the rules. But what was I supposed to do when the rules themselves seemed like the things that were keeping me from safety? When the very things I was supposed to rely on were the ones pushing me toward madness? Rule number 1, never leave the cabin after dark. But I had already broken that one. Rule number 2, do not make any sound when you hear knocking on the tower. But the knocking hadn't come back. Not yet, at least. Rule number 3, never look out over the ridge at midnight. I had done that. I had looked, and I had seen something I shouldn't have. Rule number 4, do not engage with any voice you hear calling your name. I had already heard it, and I had fought the urge to answer. Rule number 5, never trust your own shadow. And now my shadow wasn't even my own. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight in my panic. It rolled across the floor, the beam flickering on the edges of the walls, but I didn't dare bend down to retrieve it. It felt as though if I moved even 1 inch, I would be pulled into the void, consumed by whatever force lurked outside. The radio crackled again. It wasn't the manager. It wasn't a human voice. "Kyle," the voice was back. That same whisper, laced with something cruel, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand at attention. It was softer this time, closer. No, not closer. Inside. It had moved past the walls, through the cracks, slithering into the room with me. "Come closer." I slammed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice wormed its way deeper, echoing in my skull. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in on me, suffocating me with the pressure of something I couldn't explain. Every inch of the place felt wrong, like it was warping under some unseen force. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out, but I knew what would happen if I opened the door. If I stepped outside into the wilderness, into the darkness, I'd be lost. That was the lure of it, the voice, the shadows, the pull toward the ridge. But I couldn't stay here either. I couldn't let the shadows swallow me. I picked up the flashlight, forcing myself to calm down. The beam was steady now, the light pushing against the darkness. The sound of my breathing seemed too loud, too desperate in the silence, but I forced myself to move toward the back window. Outside, everything was still. The ridge was silent, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But I knew better now. I had seen what was out there, and the things I had seen weren't normal. They weren't just tricks of the light or figments of my tired mind. There was something waiting, something watching. It was almost as if the forest itself was alive, waiting for me to make a mistake. And now, I couldn't tell if the shadow that clung to my heels was me anymore, or if it was something else entirely. I swung open the door cautiously. For a moment, nothing happened. No knocking, no voices, just the rustling of the wind in the trees. But then, I saw it. A shape, faintly visible just beyond the trees, just where the forest began. It was there again, that tall, distorted figure. It stood still, unmoving, watching. It was waiting, and then it moved. Not like a normal person, but with unnatural speed, a jerking, disjointed motion like it was shifting between forms. For a split second, I saw its face, or what should have been its face, but it wasn't human, not by any stretch. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its skull, and its eyes, God, its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. They were dark, empty sockets, with only a hint of light flickering within them. I couldn't move. My feet were frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It was like I was caught in a dream, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But I had broken the first rule, hadn't I? I was outside, the door was open, I had left the cabin. The figure took another step toward me, and that's when the air around me seemed to shift. It was colder suddenly, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and makes you feel like you're not even alive anymore. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't natural. And then I heard it, more knocking. But this time it wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from behind me. I whirled around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The knocking came again, louder, closer. Each sound was deliberate, spaced out, as though it was coming from something larger, something that wasn't human. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the figure at the edge of the forest. Its head tilted to one side, the empty sockets locking with mine. The knocking continued, louder now. With every thud, I felt my resolve slipping away, like the force behind the sound was reaching inside me, pulling me apart. I looked down at the floor, at my shadow. It was no longer just a shadow, but had taken shape. It wasn't mine anymore. And then I understood. The shadow wasn't following me. It was leading me. And the worst part? It wanted me to go toward the knocking. Lily and Mark, newlyweds with a shared love of hiking and nature, had long dreamed of a honeymoon surrounded by towering trees and crisp mountain air. So when they stumbled upon the Airbnb listing for a refurbished fire lookout in the Ozarks, it felt like fate. The listing, titled Enchanted Lookout, promised seclusion, stunning panoramic views, and, most importantly, a place to escape the hustle of modern life. The price was a steal, too good to resist, and they quickly booked the place, eager for an adventure. When they arrived, the forest was exactly as they had imagined, dense and alive with the sound of rustling leaves, chirping birds, and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The tower itself was perched on a small, craggy ridge, far from the nearest town or any sign of civilization. It was a rustic structure, with a small, cozy cabin attached to the base of the tower. The view from the top was breathtaking, offering a wide expanse of trees stretching as far as the eye could see. The host, an elderly woman named Agnes, greeted them with a warm but slightly unnerving smile. She showed them around the cabin, pointing out the various amenities and giving them a small, weathered book filled with rules for their stay. For your safety and the integrity of the forest, she said in a slow, deliberate tone, these rules may seem strange, but trust me, they're necessary. Lily and Mark exchanged glances, their excitement for the trip outweighing any sense of unease. The rules, Agnes explained, were simple but vital. Respect the silence. Keep noise to a minimum, especially at night. The forest is sacred, and loud sounds disturb its balance. Stay within boundaries. Do not venture beyond the marked trails. The wilderness is unpredictable, and there are places better left undisturbed. No fires after dusk. Extinguish all fires by sunset. The flames attract unwanted attention. Avoid the eastern ridge. The ridge is sacred ground. Trespassing is forbidden and will not end well. Never. Gaze at midnight. If you wake up at midnight, keep your eyes closed until dawn. Trust me, you'll understand when the time comes. Lily chuckled, brushing off the oddities of the rules. A little superstitious, huh? She murmured, but Agnes only smiled tightly, nodding. Just follow the rules, dear. It's for your own good. With that, Agnes left them to enjoy their stay, and Lily and Mark went to explore their new surroundings. The forest, with its towering pines and thick underbrush, felt like a different world, untouched and ancient. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, and the ground was soft beneath their boots. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, the temperature dropped, and a quiet chill filled the air. They retreated back to the lookout cabin, where Mark started a small fire in the hearth. They made dinner, talked about their life together, and reveled in the tranquility of their surroundings. However, as night descended fully, the peacefulness of the forest began to feel strangely suffocating. The sounds of the animals grew quieter, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees with an eerie intensity. Lily felt a shiver creep down her spine as she glanced at the dark silhouette of the tower stretching into the night sky. Sitting by the fire, Mark seemed unfazed, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Mark looked at her quizzically. "Feel what?" "The presence," she whispered. "Like we're being watched." Mark laughed, dismissing her unease. "It's just your imagination, hon. It's so quiet out here. You're just not used to it." But Lily couldn't shake the feeling. Something about the stillness felt off, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. It wasn't long before the wind died down, leaving the forest in an unnerving silence. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Mark froze, his smile fading. "Did you hear that?" Lily nodded, her heart pounding. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped herself. "It sounded like it came from the door," she whispered. A second knock came, louder this time. "Who's there?" Mark called out, standing up cautiously. No answer. Lily's hand instinctively reached for the small, leather-bound book Agnes had given them, the one filled with rules. As she flipped it open, she saw that the first rule was staring back at her, bold and clear: respect the silence. Lily felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She closed the book and stood up. "We need to follow the rules," she said, her voice trembling. Mark hesitated. "But there's someone out there." Another knock, followed by the sound of something scraping against the door. "That's not normal," Mark muttered, his voice low. The silence that followed was suffocating. The knocking stopped, but Lily could feel the presence at the door. Something was out there, waiting, listening. They both knew the rules had to be followed, but as the minutes stretched on, it felt like the forest itself was waiting for them to break the silence. The cabin was silent now, save for the occasional crackle of the fire. But that silence was heavy, pregnant with tension. Lily sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers gripping the fabric of her hoodie as she tried to ignore the cold dread creeping into her chest. The knock had come once more, followed by that deep, guttural scrape against the door, a sound that wasn't natural. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she glanced at Mark, who was still staring at the door. "I don't think I can take much more of this," Mark muttered, his voice a strained whisper. He paced back and forth across the room, unable to sit still for long. His boots echoed on the wooden floorboards with every step, amplifying the unsettling silence that enveloped them. Lily nodded slowly, though she couldn't bring herself to speak. What had been a quiet, almost serene evening had rapidly transformed into something much darker. The isolation of the lookout tower had taken on a more sinister edge as the knocking continued. She tried to focus on the book she had pulled from the shelf earlier, reading over Rule 3 once again. Never venture past the ridge at midnight. It was almost midnight now. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing second. She had no idea what Rule 3 meant. What was waiting beyond the ridge? Was it connected to the knocking? Was it connected to the strange sense that they were not alone? Mark glanced at her, frustration evident on his face. Are you sure this is the right thing to do? I'm telling you, someone or something is out there. We can't just sit here and wait for it to come inside. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. Her instinct screamed at her not to open the door, to not confront whatever force was lurking just beyond their cabin. She had read the rules, and every fiber of her being told her to trust them. We have to stay quiet, she said softly. We can't break the rules, Mark. Her voice trembled with the weight of her own fear. She had been hiking in remote places before, but there had always been a sense of security, the knowledge that she could turn back, that the path would lead to safety. But this was different. The very air felt oppressive, and the sound of the knocking seemed to reverberate in her bones. Mark scoffed, but there was a nervous edge to his laughter. You really think that's going to work? Just sitting here pretending like nothing's wrong? Before Lily could respond, the knocking came again. A sharp, insistent rapping on the door. This time, it seemed closer, as if the thing on the other side was pressing itself against the cabin, waiting. Her breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively shrank back. The sound was no longer a mere knock. It was a warning. Mark's eyes darted to the door, and for a moment, Lily thought he might act on his frustration. She could see it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his hand twitched toward the door handle. But then, a soft murmur escaped his lips, something barely audible, almost as though he was trying to convince himself. Maybe it's just an animal, he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. Lily didn't believe it. She had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between an animal's sounds and something else entirely. This wasn't natural. Whatever was out there wasn't behaving like anything she had encountered before. The knock came again, but this time it was louder, almost urgent. Lily's pulse quickened as she stood up, her legs shaking beneath her. We can't ignore it anymore. We need to do what the rules say, she urged, her voice quivering. We need to stay silent. Mark shook his head in disbelief. You're not seriously suggesting we just stay quiet and hope this goes away, are you? I'm not going to let something get the best of us. He turned to face the door, determination in his eyes. Lily's heart sank. She knew exactly what was coming. She had read the rules, and the one thing they all had in common was clear: never engage. But Mark was already walking toward the door, his hand gripping the knob. There was no stopping him now. Lily rushed forward, grabbing his arm with a desperate plea. Mark, please, don't open the door. You don't know what's out there. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and she could see the fear in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced with a steely resolve. We have to know, Lily. We can't just sit here. He wrenched himself free from her grasp and twisted the doorknob. The door creaked open, and a gust of cold wind howled into the cabin, carrying with it a stench that nearly made her gag. It was thick, rotten, like decay, and it filled the room in an instant. Lily recoiled, but Mark stood firm, his eyes scanning the empty porch. There was nothing there, no figure, no animal, nothing at all. The only sound was the wind rushing through the trees and the distant, unnerving scrape of something against the wooden walls. But then, without warning, a voice, low, guttural, whispered from the shadows just beyond the edge of the porch. Lily. Her blood froze. The voice, unmistakable in its haunting familiarity, sent a shiver down her spine. It called her name again, a whisper carried by the wind. The sound distorted, unearthly. It was as though something was trying to coax her out into the night. Mark froze, his expression morphing from confusion to fear as he looked at her. Lily? Did you hear that? Lily's breath caught in her throat. She didn't respond, didn't dare to speak. The voice. It was wrong. All wrong. It didn't belong to anyone she knew, yet it had called her name. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "I heard it too," she whispered hoarsely, her words barely audible. "I heard it, Mark." The voice called again, but this time it was more insistent, more desperate. "Lily, come outside." She turned toward the door, her eyes wide, her chest tight. Rule 4. She had read the rules. The book said to never engage with any voice calling your name, but it was already too late. The darkness outside seemed to press closer, suffocating them both, and Lily knew deep in her gut that their safety had already been compromised. She just prayed they weren't too far gone to turn back. The night stretched on with a haunting stillness. The fire in the cabin had long since died down, leaving only the cold, dark glow of the moon casting pale shadows across the room. Mark sat by the window now, his gaze fixed on the blackness beyond, his posture tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Lily, on the other hand, hadn't moved from the couch. She couldn't bring herself to move. The air was thick with the weight of their silence, and the tension hung between them like a thick fog, making it difficult to breathe. The voice had stopped, but the unease had only grown stronger. The last thing she'd heard before the silence fell was that same whispering voice, softer now, almost like it was saying her name in the distance, but still too close to ignore. It was no longer just an eerie sound, but an omnipresent force, something out there, waiting for them to make the wrong move. "Mark." Lily's voice was trembling, barely audible. "It's almost midnight." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned from the window and their eyes met. There was a sense of resignation in his face, mixed with fear. He knew. He understood now that whatever they were up against was no ordinary force. It wasn't just the isolation of the cabin or the fear of the unknown. It was something ancient, something that didn't care about the rules they had read. The knocking had stopped too, but the air was still electric with anticipation. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, something just beyond the edge of the darkness. The rules, the warnings, all seemed so distant now, too abstract to matter anymore. But she couldn't forget what they had read. Rule 3, never venture past the ridge at midnight. Lily shifted uneasily, her eyes darting to the clock. It was nearly time. The moment they had been warned about. The moment they were told to stay inside, past the ridge, the forbidden line in the sand. She couldn't help but wonder, what was so dangerous beyond the ridge at midnight? Was it connected to the voice? Was it something else entirely? Mark pushed himself off the chair abruptly. He didn't look at her as he walked toward the door, his hand steady on the handle. "You're not seriously thinking of going out there, are you?" Lily whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. Mark didn't turn to her, but his voice was low, almost defeated. "I don't know what to believe anymore. We need to find out what's really going on out there. We can't just wait for something to happen." Lily stood up quickly, fear spiking through her veins. "Mark, please, don't. You heard the voice. You saw what happened when you opened the door. We have to stay inside. Please." He stopped in his tracks, his hand on the door handle, but he didn't turn to look at her. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of the moment. Then finally he spoke. "I don't want to leave you alone, Lily," he said, his voice soft. "But if I don't go out there, if I don't find out what's really going on, we might never leave here. We might never make it out." Lily's breath caught in her throat as she tried to process his words. He was scared. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way his shoulders tensed. And yet, he still felt the need to go out there, to test whatever was waiting beyond the ridge. Lily wanted to scream at him to stay, to hold on to the last thread of their safety, but she was frozen in place. She had never felt more powerless in her life. Then, as if the darkness outside had heard his words, the wind picked up. A low howling moan echoed across the ridge, the sound so unnatural that it sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel the air press against her skin, thick and cold. Her heart pounded in her chest, urging her to stop him before it was too late. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know what's out there. Please, don't go." But it was too late. Mark opened the door, and the moment he did, the temperature dropped drastically. The air outside seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if the night itself was alive and watching them. Lily watched in horrified silence as Mark stepped out onto the porch, the door creaking shut behind him. He paused, his form silhouetted against the moonlight for a brief moment, before he turned and walked toward the edge of the ridge, disappearing into the darkness. Lily stood motionless, staring at the spot where he had been just moments before. Every instinct in her screamed for her to go after him, to drag him back into the safety of the cabin. But she didn't move. She couldn't. The air felt like it was pressing in on her from all sides. She turned back to the clock on the wall. The hands were ticking ever closer to midnight. The silence stretched on. The knocking had stopped, but now there was something else. A low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to reverberate from deep within the earth. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more pronounced. Lily felt her pulse quicken as the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, like something massive was moving just beneath the surface. She could hear Mark's footsteps in the distance, but they weren't headed back to the cabin. He was moving farther away. She could feel her pulse racing, panic surging through her veins. This wasn't right. He shouldn't be out there. The ridge was the one place they were specifically told not to go. Was he even still alive? Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the door, listening intently. There was no sign of Mark. The rhythmic thumping grew louder, closer, and Lily felt the blood drain from her face. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, everything went still. The wind, the thumping, the very air around her seemed to hold its breath. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as she reached for the door handle, her hands shaking. Rule 3, she thought in a haze of fear. Never venture past the ridge at midnight. What had happened to Mark? Lily stood by the door, trembling, her mind racing. The eerie stillness outside was broken only by the distant sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. She didn't know what it was, but the very thought of it sent waves of terror coursing through her veins. Mark was out there, and she could no longer hear his footsteps. Had he made it to the ridge? Was he hurt? The wind had died down, but the night had taken on a new unnerving quality. The shadows seemed deeper, the moonlight too cold. Lily glanced at the clock again, but her eyes didn't focus on the numbers. Her mind couldn't break free from the question, what had happened to Mark? She needed to go out there to search for him, but Rule 3 hung like a noose around her neck. Never venture past the ridge at midnight. Her hand hovered over the door handle, her breath shallow. If she went out there and crossed the ridge, would she be making the same mistake as Mark? Would she be cursed by whatever malevolent force lingered in this forest? And if she stayed inside, would it be too late to save him? The clock ticked. Midnight was long gone now. A sudden creak from behind made Lily spin around. The back door of the cabin, the one that led into the forest, was slowly inching open. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The wind was still, so it shouldn't have been moving on its own. Someone or something was out there. Her hands were clammy as she reached for the flashlight on the table. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. She moved cautiously toward the door, every step measured, every breath shallow. But when she stepped into the entryway, her heart nearly stopped. Mark's figure was standing in the doorway. "Mark!" she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she stood frozen, staring at the silhouette that had returned from the woods. His outline was dark, almost indistinguishable from the shadows. But it was him. She could see the outline of his jacket, his boots, his face pale in the weak light. But something was off. He wasn't moving. She stepped forward slowly, her pulse thumping in her ears. "Mark, what happened? Where did you go? Why didn't you come back?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, Mark's body swayed slightly, as though he was caught in the wind. Lily's stomach churned. Something wasn't right. The tension in the room thickened. Then the door creaked again. From behind Mark, the shadows seemed to move, slither almost, like something alive, and they swept toward her, engulfing her vision. Her mind screamed, but her body refused to obey. Her feet were rooted to the ground, unable to step back, as a low, guttural growl rumbled through the space. It didn't come from Mark, but from behind him, from deep within the forest that had swallowed him. Suddenly, Mark's body lurched forward, collapsing in the doorway, his face now visible. His eyes were wide, empty, and devoid of life. There was no warmth in them, no recognition. "Lily!" The voice wasn't Mark's. It was distorted, twisted, as though it was someone or something mimicking him. The shadows enveloped her. The growl grew louder, more frantic. Her flashlight flickered, casting the briefest light on the thing that was standing just beyond the threshold. Lily screamed and stumbled backward, her hand landing on the door handle. She bolted into the cabin, locking it behind her. Her breath was ragged, every nerve on fire. She could still hear the growling, the whispers of Mark's name. But it wasn't him anymore. Whatever was outside was mimicking his voice. She spun around, searching for anything, any way to escape. She had read about things like this before. Shapeshifters, creatures that lived in the darkest corners of the world, stealing the faces of those they killed. Rule 4, never trust anything calling your name. But Mark had been calling her name. She had trusted him. She had ignored the warning in the past, and now she had to face the consequences. The knocking started again, this time at the windows. Tap, tap, tap. Loud enough to be heard over her racing heartbeat. Something was on the other side, trying to get in. But Lily couldn't look. She couldn't let her curiosity take hold. She had to survive. She had to trust the rules. She couldn't trust Mark. Lily collapsed against the far wall, gasping for air, her mind reeling. Her eyes darted toward the door, her hands still on the lock. She could hear the growling, closer now, still from outside, still behind the window, but now it seemed to echo around her, as if the darkness had completely surrounded the cabin. She thought she could hear the whispers of her own name again, coming from everywhere. Her eyes flickered toward Mark's still form, now lying motionless on the floor. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, unblinking. His body was completely still, and she was frozen, staring at him, unable to move. It was impossible to tear her gaze away. Her chest tightened in fear. Rule 5. Never trust your own shadow. Her shadow. She had forgotten. In the chaos, in the terror, she had neglected the one thing that could give her an advantage in this madness. The shadow on the wall moved. It wasn't her own. Lily's breath hitched, her heart hammering against her ribcage. Slowly, as though paralyzed, she turned her head. There it was, the shadow moving with a life of its own, expanding across the cabin floor. It crept toward her, a dark, unnatural form that mimicked her every movement but distorted it, stretching impossibly far. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The shadow began to coil, rising like a serpent, its edges jagged and unpredictable. The creature outside was now at the door. She could hear its breath, ragged, as it scratched at the walls. The whispering came closer, as if the very air around her was closing in. Lily's legs finally obeyed her. She turned, ran toward the back window, her hands frantically searching for an escape. She shoved open the latch and slipped outside, the moonlight cold against her skin. She didn't look back. She heard the sound of footsteps behind her, and then a voice, Mark's voice, whispering her name from the darkness. Lily. But Lily didn't stop running. She ran into the night, never looking back.